The phrase "before the dinosaurs" compresses more than 300 million years of biological history into a single imagined world. When we picture the prehistoric world, it is mostly dinosaurs. Ask someone to sketch the deep past, and the pencil goes straight to a T-Rex, tail whipping past a smoking volcano. This is understandable, but it collapses a staggering amount of time. If the entire history of Earth were compressed into a single calendar year, with the planet forming at midnight on the 1st of January, the first dinosaurs would not appear until roughly the middle of December. The dinosaurs, and everything that came after them, including ourselves, are crowded into the final weeks. 11.5 months of that year would already be over. Entire dynasties of predators rose, dominated their world, and disappeared before a single dinosaur egg was ever laid. Continents moved together into one enormous landmass. Oceans filled with unfamiliar hunters lost them, and then produced something even more extreme. By the time the first dinosaurs appeared, life had already survived several versions of the end of the world. The position at the top had passed from giant sea hunters to armored fish, enormous amphibians, and saber-toothed relatives of mammals. None of them ruled forever. Again and again, the planet changed, ecosystems collapsed, and the survivors rebuilt the world around themselves. I spent a long time trying to understand what that world was actually like. What I found was not a rough opening act waiting for the dinosaurs to arrive. It was a complete history of its own, shaped by strange experiments, sudden extinctions, and predators unlike anything alive today. The real question is not simply what lived before the dinosaurs. It is how life changed across those hundreds of millions of years, which creatures rose to the top, and what kept bringing their reign to an end. The problem with making this video is that I started with what seemed like a simple question. What was life like before the dinosaurs? But as it turns out, that is a much harder question to answer than I thought. For dinosaurs, we have skeletons, footprints, eggs, skin impressions, bite marks, and sometimes even stomach contents. We can often reconstruct not only the animal, but parts of the world around it. Farther back, that picture becomes less complete. Entire species may be known from fragments. A predator might survive as part of a jaw or a collection of teeth. An ecosystem may have to be reconstructed from shells, burrows, trackways, chemical traces, and a handful of exceptional fossil sites. The animals themselves also become harder to interpret. Some belonged to branches of life that later disappeared completely. They can resemble several modern groups without fitting comfortably into any of them. We know that they moved, fed, reproduced, and interacted with other animals, but the details are often scattered across different fossils and different parts of the world. To organize all this chaos, geologists divide deep time into eons, eras, and periods. This system is formalized by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and the boundaries are not simply convenient points on a calendar. Many were first recognized because the fossil record changes sharply across them. When one group disappeared, the change could be immediate in the fossil record. A large arthropod might dominate one layer of rock. In the layers above it, that same role could belong to an armored fish. These changes mark more than the replacement of one animal by another. They reflect shifts in climate, geography, ocean chemistry, vegetation, and atmospheric conditions. The world before the dinosaurs was therefore not a single ecosystem stretching across hundreds of millions of years, but a succession of distinct environments, each with its own evolutionary pressures. The boundaries between them are not always clean, and the evidence is rarely complete. But taken together, the fossil record reveals repeated periods of expansion, collapse, and biological reorganization. The first of these begins at the point where animal life becomes much easier to follow in the fossil record. The continents were still largely empty. There were no forests, grasslands, birds, reptiles, or large animals moving across the land. Most of the biological activity we can trace was concentrated in the oceans. Now, we could keep going all the way back to the origin of life. We could talk about the first oxygen in the atmosphere, the first complex cells, and the long period when nearly everything important was still happening in the oceans. But that is an enormous story on its own. What I am more interested in here is the world closer to the arrival of dinosaurs, when large animals were already established on land and complete ecosystems had formed without them. By then, forests had spread across parts of the continents. Vertebrates had pushed beyond the water's edge. Large herbivores were feeding on land, and predators were already fighting for the top position. Dinosaurs had not appeared yet, but the world they would eventually enter was already old, crowded, and shaped by several groups that had been dominant long before them. The oldest of those worlds begins in the Carboniferous, around 359 million years ago. But the part most relevant to this story came later, when complex ecosystems had spread across the land. Near the equator, parts of what are now North America and Europe were covered by broad, low-lying wetlands. This was not the condition of the entire planet. Farther south, Gondwana experienced repeated glaciations. But in these tropical basins, heat, water, and dense vegetation produced forests unlike anything alive today. Giant lycopsids, such as lepidodendron, rose on tall, narrow trunks. Calamites formed stands of jointed stems, while ferns and early seed plants occupied the spaces between them. There were no flowers or grasses. Much of the ground remained waterlogged, allowing plant material to accumulate and eventually form many of the coal seams that gave the Carboniferous its name. This environment supported an extraordinary range of arthropods. Arthropleura could exceed 2 meters in length, making it the largest land arthropod known from the fossil record. It is often shown as a giant predator, but the evidence does not support that confidently. Newly described head fossils show that it lacked the specialized venom claws of centipedes, and its diet remains uncertain. It may have fed largely on soft plants or decaying vegetation. Above the forest flew griffinflies, ancient relatives of dragonflies, some with wingspans exceeding 60 centimeters. High atmospheric oxygen may have helped certain arthropods reach these sizes, although oxygen alone cannot explain the pattern. Estimates vary, and most species remain small. The largest hunters were vertebrates, but many still controlled the land from the water. Rivers, lakes, and flooded channels supported large tetrapods with broad skulls and rows of pointed teeth. Some hunted fish. Others took smaller tetrapods and whatever animals came close to the water. Their bodies ranged from long, almost eel-shaped forms to heavier animals with stronger limbs. One early example, Whatcheria, reached around 2 meters and appears to have grown rapidly while young. It was a substantial predator, although its anatomy suggests that water still formed an important part of its life. This was the weakness shared by many Carboniferous giants. Their dominance depended on wetlands for movement, feeding, reproduction, or some combination of the three. On firmer ground, vertebrate herbivory was only beginning to become established. A few early tetrapod lineages had started processing plants, creating a more direct link between the forests and the animals feeding on land. But the great populations of large herbivores seen later in the Permian did not yet exist. Small amniotes were also moving through the forest floor. Most were modest animals, probably hunting insects and other small prey. But unlike many of the larger tetrapods around them, they could reproduce without placing their eggs directly in open water. Near the end of the Carboniferous, the first known synapsids appeared. At this stage, they were small and easily overlooked. There was little to suggest that their descendants would soon produce the largest herbivores and most powerful predators on land. Around 307 million years ago, many coal-forming wetlands in Euramerica became fragmented as climates grew more variable and, in some regions, drier. This was not one sudden global collapse, and the forests did not disappear everywhere at once. But animals closely tied to continuous wetlands lost territory, while those capable of reproducing and feeding farther from water gained access to expanding seasonal environments. The old rulers did not vanish immediately. Large amphibious predators survived long after the Carboniferous ended. But the animals best prepared for the next world were not the giants wading in the rivers. They were the smaller amniotes, moving almost unnoticed beneath the forest. And one branch of them was about to produce the first great dynasty of land predators. That branch was the synapsids. They first appeared before the Permian, but it was during the early Permian, beginning around 299 million years ago, that some of them became the largest herbivores and most powerful predators on land. One of the best records of this world comes from the red beds of what are now Texas and Oklahoma. These rocks preserve river channels, floodplains, seasonal pools, and the animals buried within them. But they represent only part of Pangaea, not the entire planet. Early Permian ecosystems varied considerably between regions. The old Carboniferous wetlands had not disappeared completely. Large amphibian-grade predators still lived around rivers and shallow water. Archaeops, with its broad skull and heavily built body, could reach around 2 meters long. It probably hunted from the water or its edges, taking fish and smaller tetrapods. But farther from the water, a different food web was forming. Large-scale vertebrate herbivory had become much more common. Animals such as Diadectes had heavy bodies and specialized teeth for processing fibrous plants. It was not a synapsid, and its precise position near the origin of amniotes remains debated. But ecologically, it occupied a role that had barely existed in earlier land ecosystems. There was also Edaphosaurus, one of the earliest large herbivorous synapsids. It had a relatively small head, a broad body, and dense batteries of teeth inside its mouth. These probably helped it process plant material, although exactly how it chewed remains difficult to reconstruct. Across its back rose a tall sail supported by elongated spines. Similar sails appeared independently in several early synapsid groups, but their purpose is still uncertain. Temperature regulation has often been proposed. Display, recognition, or a combination of functions may also have been important. Whatever the sail was doing, Edaphosaurus was part of an important change. Plants were now supporting large-bodied vertebrates, and those herbivores could support larger predators. The most famous was Dimetrodon. It is often placed beside dinosaurs, but it lived more than 30 million years before the earliest dinosaurs appeared. It belonged to the synapsid branch and was therefore more closely related to mammals than to dinosaurs, although it was still far removed from anything we would recognize as a mammal. There was no single standard Dimetrodon. The genus contained several species that differed considerably in size. The largest approached 4 meters or more, while others were much smaller. Its skull was deep and narrow, with teeth of different sizes along the jaw. Enlarged teeth near the front helped seize prey, while the teeth behind them could cut into flesh. This degree of dental differentiation was still relatively simple compared with later therapsids, but it allowed Dimetrodon to process large prey more effectively than many earlier land predators. It also carried an enormous sail. As with Edaphosaurus, we cannot say confidently what it was for. The traditional idea is that blood flowing through the sail helped the animal absorb or release heat. But the structure may also have been visible from a distance, making it useful for display or communication. Fossils preserve the bones supporting it, not its color, blood supply, or behavior. Even its position as an apex predator requires some caution. The red bed deposits contain several carnivorous synapsids of different sizes, alongside large amphibious hunters. They were probably dividing prey and habitats between them, rather than fitting into one simple hierarchy. What does appear more clearly is that predator-prey relationships were becoming more specialized. Large herbivores were processing tougher vegetation. Carnivorous synapsids were developing skulls adapted for stronger or faster bites. Competition on land was becoming more intense. Then, near the transition into the Middle Permian, this familiar sail-backed world disappeared from the fossil record. Exactly how quickly it happened is difficult to establish. The terrestrial record contains geographical gaps, and some apparent turnovers may be exaggerated by where fossils happen to be preserved. But when the record becomes clearer again, animals such as Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus are gone. The synapsids remain, but their anatomy has changed. Their limbs were beginning to move into a more upright position. Their jaws and teeth became more specialized, and some developed bodies capable of supporting far larger and more active animals. These were the therapsids, and they would produce the most formidable world that existed before dinosaurs. The first therapsids appear abruptly in the fossil record, already divided into several very different groups. Their earlier history is still poorly preserved, so we cannot trace a clean transformation from animals like Dimetrodon into the forms that followed. What we can see is that by the Middle Permian, around 273 million years ago, the balance of power on land had changed. The earliest major therapsid world belonged to the Dinocephalians. Their fossils have been found across widely separated parts of Pangaea, including what are now South Africa, Russia, China, and Brazil. This suggests that they were not a small regional experiment. For a time, they were among the largest animals living on land. Some, such as moschops, were heavy-bodied plant eaters with broad torsos and thickened skulls. Others were predators. Ankylosaurus carried an enormous head, armed with large canines and powerful jaw muscles. Its body was still built differently from that of a modern mammalian predator, but studies of its skull and inner ear suggest an animal capable of relatively fast, directed movements while attacking prey. Even here, caution is necessary. We know the shape of its skull and the mechanics available to it. We do not know exactly how it hunted, whether it attacked from cover, or how frequently it pursued large prey. Dinocephalian ecosystems contained several forms with thickened or ornamented skulls. These structures are sometimes interpreted as evidence of headbutting or display, but the behavior itself has not been preserved. The bones tell us that their heads were important. They do not tell us exactly how they used them. Then, after a comparatively short reign, the Dinocephalians disappeared. The cause remains debated. Their decline occurred during a period of environmental disruption in the Middle Permian, but gaps in terrestrial rocks make the timing difficult to compare globally. What is clear is that the ecosystems that followed were organized around a different set of animals. Among the most successful were the dicynodonts. Most had a horny beak, few or no ordinary teeth, and in many species a pair of projecting tusks. They ranged from relatively small burrowers to large, heavily built herbivores. Their jaws were specialized for cropping and processing vegetation, although the exact movement of the beak and the role of the tusks probably differed between species. By the late Permian, dicynodonts had become some of the most abundant herbivores on land. They were joined by pariasaurs, broad-bodied plant eaters with heavily constructed skulls and bony growths embedded in the skin. Together, these animals supported a new generation of predators. The most distinctive were the Gorgonopsians. Early members of the group were relatively small. Over time, some developed longer skulls, wider gapes, and enormous canine teeth. Species such as Inostrancevia and Rubigia were among the largest land predators near the end of the Permian. Their canine teeth are often compared with those of saber-toothed cats, but the resemblance evolved independently. Gorgonopsians appeared more than 200 million years before the most famous mammalian saber-tooths. The teeth were also vulnerable. Long canines could penetrate deeply, but they were poorly suited to crushing bone or resisting uncontrolled sideways forces. Gorgonopsians probably used them with a degree of precision, but whether they delivered repeated bites, held prey, or withdrew after a deep wound cannot be established confidently. They were not alone. Theranocephalians included both small hunters and relatively large carnivores with powerful jaws. Cynodonts were still less prominent, but their anatomy was beginning to change in ways that would later become important in mammal evolution. This should not be mistaken for a simple progression toward mammals. Most therapsid branches left no descendants. They were adapting to their own world, not preparing for one hundreds of millions of years in the future. By the late Permian, terrestrial ecosystems had become more specialized than ever before. Large herbivores processed different kinds of vegetation. Predators differed in size, skull strength, and feeding strategy. Recent biomechanical studies suggest that carnivorous synapsids were occupying a growing range of feeding roles rather than competing as interchangeable hunters. This was the most complex land world Earth had yet produced. And then, around 252 million years ago, it began to collapse. The causes involved enormous volcanic activity, rapid warming, disruption of rainfall, and severe changes in the oceans and atmosphere. But the extinction did not necessarily unfold at the same moment or in the same way everywhere. Different terrestrial ecosystems may have broken down at different times. By the time it was over, the Dinocephalians were already gone. Gorgonopsians disappeared. Most Dicynodont and Theracephalian lineages vanished, along with many of the plants and prey communities that had sustained them. The world immediately before dinosaurs had lost almost all of its rulers. The next chapter begins with what survived. The next world did not begin with dinosaurs. It began with survivors. After the end Permian extinction, the complex food webs of the late Permian were gone. The ecosystems that replaced them were initially less diverse, with fewer large herbivores and fewer specialized predators. Recovery was neither immediate nor uniform. Conditions differed across Pangaea, and some regions recovered more quickly than others. But much of the early Triassic appears to have remained climatically unstable, with repeated heat, drought, and disruption to vegetation. One of the most successful survivors was Lystrosaurus. It was a Dicynodont, part of the same broad therapsid lineage that have produced many Permian herbivores. It had a beak, 2 tusks, and a heavily built body supported by short limbs. Lystrosaurus is often described as dominating the entire world after the extinction. That is probably too broad. Its fossils are especially abundant in parts of southern Africa and Antarctica, but the early Triassic contained other animals and varied between regions. Still, in the South African fossil record, its abundance is difficult to ignore. Research on its bones suggests that early Triassic individuals generally matured younger and died earlier than their Permian relatives. Breeding before reaching a large adult size may have helped populations recover quickly in an unpredictable environment, although this remains an interpretation rather than something directly observed. The predators living around them were also different from those of the Permian. Large Gorgonopsians were gone. Some surviving therapsids remained carnivorous, but another lineage was beginning to expand: the Archosauromorphs, the broader reptile group that would eventually include crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Among the earliest large forms was Proterosuchus. It had a long body, sprawling limbs, and an elongated skull with a downward curving snout. It lived close to the beginning of the Triassic and probably preyed on smaller vertebrates, although its exact hunting behavior is difficult to reconstruct. Water still held serious predators as well. Large temnospondyls survived the extinction and remained common in rivers, lakes, and floodplains. Some had broad, flattened skulls and waited for fish or terrestrial animals near the water's edge. So even after the Permian collapse, land did not pass directly from synapsids to dinosaurs. The world was shared by surviving therapsids, giant amphibians, and rapidly diversifying reptiles. By the Middle Triassic, roughly 247 to 237 million years ago, terrestrial ecosystems had become more complex again. Dicynodonts produced new large-bodied herbivores. Cynodonts included animals such as Cynonathus, a heavily built predator with differentiated teeth and powerful jaws. These animals belonged to the synapsid lineage, showing that the relatives of mammals were still important long after the disappearance of the Gorgonopsians. Archosauromorphs were expanding into an even wider range of forms. In what is now India, Shringosaurus grew 3 to 4 meters long and carried a pair of horns above its eyes. Not every individual possessed them, suggesting that they may have been connected to sex, display, or combat within the species, although the exact behavior remains uncertain. The major predators included erythrosuchids, such as Erythrosuchus. Its skull was enormous in proportion to its body, with large teeth and powerful areas for jaw muscle attachment. it was not a dinosaur or a crocodile, but an earlier archosauriform, occupying one of the largest terrestrial predator roles of its time. The herbivores beneath these predators were becoming more specialized. Dicynodonts, rhynchosaurs, and other reptile groups processed vegetation in different ways rather than occupying one interchangeable feeding role. This division of food resources helped create increasingly complex terrestrial communities. Some dicynodonts may even have lived socially. Large accumulations of fossil droppings from the Middle to Late Triassic have been interpreted as communal latrines, suggesting repeated group use of the same locations. And somewhere within this crowded world, the dinosaur lineage had already begun. Small dinosauromorphs were present by the Middle Triassic. They were lightly built animals living among much larger and more established competitors. Depending on how several fragmentary fossils are classified, the lineage may extend deeper than the oldest unquestionable dinosaur skeletons. The first widely accepted dinosaurs appear later, around 233 to 230 million years ago. But their arrival was not a takeover. The earliest dinosaurs entered ecosystems still occupied by large synapsid herbivores, powerful archosaur predators, and many other reptile groups. For millions of years, they remained only one part of that world. Dinosaurs did not inherit an empty planet. They entered a world rebuilt by survivors, already crowded with creatures that had endured the worst extinction Earth had ever produced. When dinosaurs finally became dominant, the older world did not disappear all at once. Some of its survivors had already endured the end Permian extinction by being small, adaptable, or able to tolerate unstable environments. Burrowing, flexible diets, and rapid reproduction may have helped certain groups, although no single explanation fits every survivor. Dicynodonts recovered after the extinction and remained important herbivores for much of the Triassic. Some later forms became larger than Lystrosaurus and lived alongside the earliest dinosaurs. But their diversity gradually declined, and the group disappeared before the Jurassic ecosystems dominated by large dinosaurs were fully established. The giant temnospondyls also survived longer than we might expect. They remained major aquatic predators throughout the Triassic, sharing rivers and lakes with dinosaurs on land. A few isolated branches persisted beyond the end of the period, showing that dinosaur dominance did not remove every older lineage immediately. The archosaur relatives that had competed with early dinosaurs followed a different path. During much of the late Triassic, crocodile-lion archosaurs occupied many of the largest terrestrial predator roles. Dinosaurs were present, but they were not yet controlling every ecosystem. Both groups often hunted similar prey and occupied overlapping ecological positions. Then, around 201 million years ago, another mass extinction struck at the end of the Triassic. Many of the large crocodile-lion competitors disappeared. Dinosaurs survived, and during the early Jurassic, they expanded into ecological roles that had suddenly been left open. Their dominance appears to have resulted from repeated environmental crises and extinction events, not one simple victory over inferior animals. But one branch of the older synapsid world never vanished. Small cynodonts continued changing throughout the Triassic. Their descendants developed increasingly mammal-like jaws, teeth, ears, and skulls. Eventually, they produced the first mammalia forms. For most of the dinosaur era, these animals remained relatively small and lived outside the largest terrestrial roles. But they survived every dinosaur dynasty. The world before dinosaurs was not completely replaced. Part of it became mammals.